My name is Ann Albert. I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I am here to welcome you all to the beginning of our 2023 continuation, not only of our public programming in general, but specifically of our series of talks on Jewish law and the US Constitution that began in the fall. I'm very, very happy to introduce Britt Tevis. Britt Tevis is a historian with special interests in law and Jewish studies and a perfect match for the kinds of things that we are exploring in this series. She's currently a Boston University Public History postdoctoral associate in anti-Semitism studies, doing research at the National Archives in DC. Britt was a fellow here at the Katz Center 2 years ago during our year on the theme of America's Jewish questions, after receiving her PhD and JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, hi Britt, and holding a postdoc at Yale in the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. She's currently completing her first book project with a tentative title, May It Displease the Court, Jewish Legal Networks and the Democratization of American Law. And it's a project that tries to show how a Jewish legal network pioneered new fields of practice and reshaped existing ones as it worked towards making the American legal system more equitable and inclusive. She also has articles that have appeared in the American Journal of Legal History and American Jewish History. So you can sort of see the scope and the range and the thrust of what Britt is working on. With that, I just want to welcome you and turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you as well to the Katz Center staff, to Brian and Deanna and Anne for facilitating this event today. I'm so pleased to join you, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity. As you heard, I'm here as a part of the Jewish Law and Constitution series, which was convened in light of the Katz Center's focus on Jews and modern legal culture during this academic year. The Katz Center asked speakers in one way or another to highlight entanglements between Jewish life and the American legal system. And many of these talks have focused on conflict between Jewish law and American law, the ways that Jewish legal norms have intersected and clashed with the US Constitution and the resulting negotiations that followed. They've explored legal pluralism and thought about the ways that Jewish law and American law have coexisted. Today, I want to contribute to the series by having us examine some tensions between non-Jewish Americans' perceptions of Jews' legal engagement with the American legal system and Jewish Americans' thoughts on the same. And rather than a play-by-play of litigation of a particular issue, today I want to illuminate the broader historical context that these legal entanglements took place in, and I'll do so by examining some early debates about Jewish lawyers in the United States. As I'll show today, since the rise of the modern legal profession in the late 19th century, non-Jews and especially non-Jewish lawyers have viewed Jewish lawyers as conduits of Jewish law and legal arguments meant to advance Jewish rights, and thus as threats. As such, Jewish lawyers triggered backlash, which included efforts by Jewish lawyers to challenge the ideas that were circulated about them. So to begin, I want to first draw your attention to an image that I'm going to share. Hopefully that has been shared. And what you're looking at right now is a cover from a 1907 Puck magazine, which was a weekly publication founded by the cartoonist Joseph Kepler, and was Puck magazine circulated in the late 19th, early 20th century United States, and it generally promoted Democratic Party talking points through humorous visual representations for which it was famous. And Joseph Kepler was a very famous late 19th, early 20th century cartoonist. Now, as you can see, this image includes three men. First, an unknowing and innocent Uncle Sam. Second, an unnamed stout public servant it says public servant on his collar, who's wrapped in a jacket that is labeled corporation. And this figure sort of represents a rotund child. And third, we see closest to the viewer's gaze, a corporate lawyer whose hook nose and overgrown beard, bushy eyebrows, and stooping stance tell us that he's a Jew. The Jewish lawyer in this image represents a looming threat unseen to most Americans. And we know this is because of a few component parts of this image. First, we can see that each figure here has its own line of action. Uncle Sam is standing straight up. He's not moving. He's unaware that he's being robbed. The childlike public servant behind him is stealing whatever he has. And though foremost in the reader's line of sight, within the image itself, the Jewish lawyer is in the back, overseeing the crime, hunching as he rubs his seemingly dirty hands together from behind a brick wall. In addition to these contrasting lines of action, there are a few other clues that identify this Jewish lawyer as the true culprit in the scene for the reader. First, we have this brick wall, which shields the lawyer from being seen by Uncle Sam and indicates that even if Uncle Sam could see through that brick wall, he couldn't see through the brick wall. He couldn't possibly determine that it's the Jewish lawyer, not the public servant, who's actually to blame. In fact, the Jewish lawyer's power is really only for the viewer who sees the scene to understand. The way that Kepler foregrounded the Jewish lawyer and cast him in distinctly dark blues and blacks likewise communicates to the viewer that the Jewish lawyer is the real impetus behind the corruption. Finally, and most directly, admittedly, there's a text that accompanies this image, and at the bottom it reads, "The American Fagin, instructor in the art of stealing and getting away with it." So on this cover, Jewish lawyers are presented as coaching public officials on how to take advantage of the upright Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, of course, being America, American law, the American federal government, and by extension, the Constitution. The specific circumstances that resulted in this image involved concern for an evergreen issue, campaign finance law. During the 1904 presidential election between incumbent Republican Theodore Roosevelt and Democratic nominee New York Judge Alton B. Parker, Democrats accused Roosevelt of receiving corporate cash for his campaign. He had supposedly accepted something like $50,000 from life insurance companies. In response to those accusations, both parties worked together to pass limitations on corporate spending in elections. They passed a lukewarm, ineffective law known as the Tillman Act of 1907, named for the notorious white supremacist Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina. Now, this was the first national law to regulate corporate campaign contributions in the United States. Jews, and specifically Jewish lawyers, played no role in this episode. In 1907, certainly none of the major insurance companies had Jews as their presidents or as their lawyers or as CEOs or even as agents. But those facts did not deter the editors of Puck from casting a Jewish lawyer as a symbolic stand-in for corrupt corporate entities overseeing the extortion of the American government and people. Beyond the specifics of that circumstance, this Puck cover conveys widespread ideas among non-Jewish Americans about the relationship between Jewish lawyers and the federal government and the Constitution. Namely, that Jewish lawyers were shady, and if permitted to practice, they would mar the character and the essence of the American legal system. Readers in 1907 understood this without explanation. And to understand why and how they would understand this implicitly requires us to go and learn about a figure that I've called and identified as the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster. Stop sharing my screen now. Who was this ubiquitous Jewish Shyster? As imagined by non-Jewish legal practitioners, the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster was a money-obsessed, dishonest, and incapable of understanding American law. Nevertheless, he was uniquely skilled at employing his technical skills and employing the law's technical rules for his own gain. Most significantly, the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster was omnipresent. He could be found seemingly everywhere, a fact that underscored the threat that he posed. This cultural configuration was commonplace in the late 19th and early 20th century. And today I want to share his origins with you, because understanding this explains how Jewish lawyers, and by extension Jewish law, became seen as inherently distinct, separate, and at odds with American law. To the degree that Jews both argued in and outside of courts that in fact was not, that these things were actually complementary and that Americans need not fear them. The power of this figure also helped justify the segregation of Jews in the legal profession. Now, before the Civil War, representations of Jewish lawyers were rare in cultural spaces. Yet those that did appear, and again, there were very few, those that did appear depicted Jewish lawyers as incapable of grasping Christian standards of morality. And this was either implicitly or explicitly identified as key to the practice of law. Without understanding Christianity and Christian standards of morality, one couldn't practice law effectively. Jewish lawyers as a generic ideal sometimes appeared in local papers, which printed articles that discussed Christian biblical parables. For example, Jewish lawyers materialized in retellings of the parable of the Good Samaritan, a story in which a Jew or a group of Jews, depending on the teller, asked Christ to identify the most important law, and then Christ explaining the necessity of treating strangers with kindness. The following story, for example, appeared in an 1863 Alabama paper. Quote, "One day a Jewish lawyer came to the Lord Jesus and asked how he could reach heaven. In return, Jesus asked what the scriptures answered. Replying to Christ, the Jewish lawyer said, 'Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy strength and with all thy mind and thy neighbor as thyself.' Jesus tells the lawyer that he's correct. He answered correctly. However, then the lawyer returns to Jesus and says, 'Who was my neighbor?' Showing, quote, his willingness to perhaps find a flaw in the answer in order to excuse himself from the great law of love. Jewish lawyers, in other words, technically knew the correct answer to Christ's question, but refused to accept the answer as being correct. Again, these early representations, such as the one I just shared, were exceedingly rare and often did not emphasize the role of Jewish lawyers in the explanation of their respective texts. They were really just background accessories here. But the presence of the Jewish lawyer in the broader culture changed drastically in the 1860s, and especially after the Civil War, when Jewish lawyers as an imagined collective group began to appear in the public discourse much more frequently. For the first time, rhetorically, Jewish lawyers constituted a distinct collective. They were thought of as a group, not just as lone individual lawyers who happened to be Jewish. During this moment, Jewish lawyers, who again remained statistically rare as far as on-the-ground lawyers, there were still exceedingly few of those, but as an abstract idea, they came to embody certain tropes and ideas that could be found easily in the broader culture. The first of these ideas was that Jews, and this again plays on earlier depictions, that Jewish lawyers were spiritually corrupt because they didn't understand Christ. For example, the Wisconsin judge Moses Strong discussed Jewish lawyers when describing the kind of lawyer that new practitioners ought to avoid emulating. Strong was a framer of the Wisconsin Constitution and the first president of its state bar. In his 1879 commencement address to law graduates at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he stressed that graduates must avoid acting like Jewish lawyers who betrayed Jesus. Quote, "Of more value than all else," he asserted, was, quote, "the approval of a self-satisfied conscience and to avert the woes denounced against the Jewish lawyers by the Savior of mankind." In 1894, a reverend in River Falls, Massachusetts, Massachusetts, juxtaposed Jewish lawyers' knowledge with that of Christ. He described Jewish lawyers as individuals whose, quote, chief duty was simply to explain the law and apply it to the people. Christ, by contrast, quote, taught of himself and for himself, and consequently the people understood the difference between the character of his teaching and that of Jewish lawyers. He taught as the one who had true authority, end quote. Here, Jewish lawyers were untrustworthy despite their technical knowledge because, unlike Christ, they didn't appreciate the law's fundamental meaning. Jewish lawyers' supposed spiritual corruption even inspired some to advocate that only Christians be permitted to practice law in the United States. Indiana Presbyterian minister Joseph Cloakey warned, quote, there are unworthy ones in the profession, known sometimes as pettifoggers and or shysters. These types often use their power to defeat justice. He then reasoned that lawyers should, quote, be a man of high character, of integrity, and purity of life. These are the qualities that enter into a Christian character, and hence I ask the lawyer, why should he not be a Christian? Beginning around the 1870s, Jewish lawyers, like nearly all Jews who engaged in professional spaces in the United States, Jewish lawyers were portrayed as money obsessed. This trope, of course, invoked ideas about Jewish greed, which first emerged during the Middle Ages, when religious and political authorities cast Jews as moneylenders. For example, in an 1884 article in a Chicago newspaper, there were reports on political rivals Adam Kramer and General Charles Brown, noting and describing them that Kramer is a rich Hebrew lawyer and General Brown, also a lawyer, lost a leg in the war. By identifying Kramer as a Jew and linking him with the profession of law and wealth, the paper strengthened pre-existing associations between the three, and then juxtaposed them with associations of a patriotic lawyer who, as symbolized by his missing leg, sacrificed himself for his country. Likewise, stray references to Jews committing crimes involving money often appeared without much context. In 1881, San Francisco's Daily Evening Bulletin announced, quote, Gottlieb Engel of Chicago, a Hebrew lawyer, has absconded and is guilty of large embezzlements. And that was the entirety of the article. No additional information was included. We just know that a lawyer engaged in embezzlement and is gone. Stories that depicted Jewish lawyers as excessively interested in money also portrayed them as especially keen to exploit the state and communal institutions. In 1885, South Carolina's Intelligencer published a far-fetched story titled Making Money Easily, in which a Jewish lawyer purportedly traveled to an unspecified city every winter to file, quote, great claims upon the government. And this is the lawyer talking, supposedly. I make money so easily and abundantly that it is going to be an embarrassment. And this is the case with all of my family. We're rich, and we grow richer without any difficulty. Emphasizing the lawyer's intelligence, yet also signaling that his cosmopolitan nature was suspect, the article's author stressed that the Jewish lawyer was exceptionally talented, a polyglot, well-traveled, and connected. Again, here we have a depiction of a Jewish lawyer's love of money manifesting itself in taking advantage of the government. In addition to morally deficient and greedy, Jewish lawyers were cast as deceptive and unscrupulous. Media sources conveyed that Jewish lawyers did whatever was necessary to achieve their goals, including invoking their religious practices for strategic purposes. For example, according to an 1896 report about a police court in Chicago, a Jewish lawyer, quote, pounded on the desk and demanded in violent tones a continuance of a case for a client on the grounds that it was a Jewish holiday. After the judge granted his wish, the lawyer retreated to the lobby where the reporter supposedly saw him rubbing his hands together with satisfaction, a sign of the lawyer's impure intent. Jewish lawyers' dishonesty in court also triggered accusations of them changing their names for the purpose of tricking non-Jews into hiring them. And there's, of course, an inverse of this happening that goes on in a Curb Your Enthusiasm. where a non-Jew changed his name to a Jewish name in order to be hired by people. Jewish lawyers were also portrayed as exceptionally litigious. In 1893, a report coming from a Lower East Side police court editorialized, "The Russian Jew is dirty in his person, litigious and quarrelsome in his disposition. They seem to have but the crudest ideas of honor or honesty. They are quite ready to cheat each other." The same report noted that the judge in the court told the Jewish defendant standing before him, "I'm sick of this. You Jews come here with your complaints and occupy most of my time in this court. There are other people who have rights as well as you." The judge then accused Jews of filing frivolous lawsuits without the slightest scintilla of evidence to support them. Whether engaging in questionable practices or deceiving their clients or bringing unwinnable cases, Jewish lawyers were unscrupulous. Finally, the final major characteristic of the ubiquitous Jewish lawyer that emerges in the post-Civil War decades is the idea that the Jewish lawyer was omnipresent and thus inherently threatening. It was this idea that Jewish lawyers were omnipresent that planted the seed and was the origins of the idea of Jewish disproportionality, which is an idea that remains with us today. The idea that there are somehow an abundance of Jewish lawyers and too many Jewish lawyers within the profession. And the idea of Jewish disproportionality emerges long before the actual fact, or if one concedes that such fact exists. So Jewish omnipresence took several forms. First, it appeared as a simple fact, assertion of fact. In a number of newspapers, including an 1885 article published in Indiana, the radical abolitionist journalist James Redpath claimed to have learned from an anonymous source that Jews comprised a significant percentage of the legal profession. He claimed to have learned this information from an unnamed Jewish lawyer who reputedly told him, quote, "There are more lawyers among the Jews than among any other race or faith. I say this without having actually counted their numbers, but simply from my own personal observation. The proportion seems to increase every year." It's unclear whose Redpath's source was or if that source even existed, but this was an assertion made in a public paper. Periodicals often also published headcounts of Jewish lawyers in given places. For example, in 1897, Ohio's Dayton Evening Herald stated that Dayton was home to one Jewish lawyer. And again, these would be single lines just announcing in local papers the number of Jewish lawyers in a given town. Assertions of Jewish lawyers' numerical expansion also appeared alongside random facts without explanation or context. In 1897, several national newspapers printed haphazard lists of supposed facts and figures. This included information such as Seattle will tax churches. Japan has one leather shoe mill. New York has 400 Hebrew lawyers. This list appeared in New York's Amelia Daily Gazette and Free Press on June 25th, as well as the news in Frederick, Maryland on July 1st. In this context, the number of Jewish lawyers was just presented as a piece of trivia, information with little obvious importance or value, but it was still presented as true. Finally, Jewish lawyers' omnipresence appeared in discussions of Jewish lawyers abroad, which appeared in the American press in part to serve as warnings to American readers. For example, in 1873, the Boston Globe noted, reporting from London, Jews are rejoicing over the increase in the number of their religionists at the bar. In 1886, referring to Austria and Germany in an article highlighting Jewish exceptionalism, another paper reported, "The judiciary of those countries is largely manned by Hebrew jurists." In 1889, the Des Moines Leader informed its readers, quote, "The Paris bar has no very remarkable Hebrew lawyer just now, but there are many magistrates of high standing." In 1884, a Pennsylvania paper reported, quote, "More than one half and probably 2/3 of the lawyers in Berlin are Hebrews. These numbers were meant to warn readers about the dangers of permitting too many Jews to practice law. As an 1889 article published in a theological periodical in Oberlin, Ohio discussed, quote, the overcrowding of the professions in Germany by Jewish students has become a distinct social problem. Now, reason suggests that these articles circulated inaccurate assessments of the number of Jewish lawyers in the United States. Many reported figures that were just far too round to be correct. Many were too vague to be read as numerically accurate. Figures such as over 100 or over 200 could have meant 101, or they could have meant 1,000, leaving readers to interpret them as they pleased. Also, these reports frequently contradicted each other, reporting different numbers of lawyers in the same place at the same time. And finally, collectively, the trajectories of the Jewish legal population in given places as presented by these publications don't make sense when understood in the context of Jewish immigration, which between 1880 and 1924 saw the arrival of approximately 2 million Jews in the United States. Nevertheless, the dissemination of these statistics about Jewish lawyers were important. For one, because they communicated that turn-of-the-century American Jewish lawyers needed to be counted, and that act contributed to the sense of Jewish lawyers' omnipresence. Counting Jewish lawyers demarcated Jewish lawyers as the other within the profession because no other group was identified and isolated through such statistical assessments. The omnipresence of the Jewish lawyer as manifest in these constant statistical assessments of Jewish lawyers also contributed to the figure of the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster, which became a cultural figure that actually I would argue remains with us today, but at the time is especially significant because of the ramifications of how he operated within the legal profession. Now, one might ask at this point, why did the ubiquitous Jewish lawyer appear in the late 19th century? For one, this was a moment when the late 19th century saw a huge expansion of both the American legal system as far as courts, but also the legal profession. This really kicked off a decades-long period of expansion. The growth of the legal profession displeased established practitioners and especially elite practitioners who viewed newcomers as threats. The established bar responded to this perceived threat by instituting a program of professionalization. Included in this professionalization, a part of this process involved non-Jewish lawyers refashioning Jewish lawyers as foil characters to the perceived legal practitioner. Jewish lawyers served as useful scapegoats for established practitioners because they were much more visible within the moment, far more so than newly emergent cohorts of Christian lawyers. And this was especially the case because Jews tended to live in cities where they live close to one another. So they appear to be, they just are very prominent in places with large legal communities. Accordingly, the perception of Jewish lawyers as dishonest and abundant as threats helped to justify the creation of all sorts of institutional norms that we continue to have, but also were imposed in the early 20th century. And this includes, and in some cases in the late 19th century, this includes the creation of admission standards, discriminatory admissions, exclusionary bar associations, the segregation of legal firms, pay discrimination, as well as an inherent distrust of Jews in courtrooms. Now, it's important to note that as non-Jewish lawyers and non-Jews constructed this ubiquitous Jewish Shyster, Jews and particularly Jewish lawyers responded by attempting to construct their own figure. And this is the mirror image in some ways, the inverse of the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster. The Jewish press instead, in response, depicted Jewish lawyers as boons to American society and democracy, and as evidence of its best tendencies. Jewish lawyers according to these writers and publishers, were professional ideals. Like their non-Jewish counterparts, these publications spread the idea that Jewish lawyers were numerically abundant and uniquely skilled, but they interpret those facts differently. Instead of interpreting them as bad for or potentially problematic for the character of American law, they saw the number of Jewish lawyers as evidence of Jewish fitness for citizenship and how well Jews had embraced democracy. So here's one example of any number of examples of the ubiquitous Jewish lawyers, in some ways, alter ego. And here we see an expression of it from a man named Saul Cohen, who spoke at an event hosted by the Young Men's Hebrew Association, a communal institution, which was meant to foster the spiritual and intellectual well-being of young men in New York. At the time, Cohen was 30 years old. He was a lawyer, and he had founded a firm with his partner, Simpson Wolf, in New York City. And he was presumably invited to speak to this group because he embodied the ideal of professional success. His lecture on March 18th, 1884, was titled "The American Lawyer of the Future." And in this talk, he simultaneously defended the integrity of the country's legal profession, and he identified Jewish lawyers as guardians of democracy. His speech presented a wistful view of lawyers' place in society, and he also invoked essentialized notions about Jewishness. He claimed that Jews naturally possessed qualities that made them effective lawyers. Their temperament supposedly explained their enthusiasm for participating in the profession. Quote, "The Jewish character presents many of the elements essential to success at the bar and to attract to the pursuit of law." He pointed to the comparatively large numbers of Jewish men now at the bar or fitting themselves for the bar as evidence of his assertions. He then contextualized American Jewish lawyers in the history of Jewish lawyers globally. Paradoxically, then, he also explained why Jews in the United States had yet to produce a well-known legal representative. Again, this is an implicit response to the creation of this ubiquitous Jewish lawyer, explaining why there isn't an outstanding Jewish lawyer. He said, because, quote, "Remember now we have practically the first generation of Jewish lawyers in this country," and then promised that Jewish lawyers would become even more upstanding and better than they already were. He anticipated that one day American Jews would have public champions akin to France's Adolphe Cornu, and who was a major advocate of Jewish causes in 19th century Europe. His speech illuminated two core beliefs about Jewish lawyers that were shared by late 19th century Jews and non-Jews, and one point of contention. First, conventional thinking at the time was that Jews were uniquely skilled legal practitioners. And this was supposedly because of a manifestation of their genetic makeup. The idea is that they had possessed distinctive characteristics and lent themselves to legal practice. Again, reflected the emergence of racial science at the time. He also reflected the idea and expressed the idea that Jewish lawyers had recently entered the legal profession in droves. And this idea was reiterated by the Jewish press, which, like the non-Jewish press, also offered lists of Jewish lawyers in given places and claims about how many Jewish lawyers were practicing here and there. Of course, the point of disagreement was about the number of Jewish lawyers in the legal profession and their proclivities to practice law. The point of disagreement is what this meant for the law. In Cohen's estimation, this was a good thing. This proved America's democratic nature and its potential to further its democracy. In his telling, Jewish lawyers were patriotic advocates and substantiated America's claims to embody democratic norms, whereas the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster was evidence of the danger that await American democracy should there not be steps taken in order to limit the number of Jewish lawyers who practice law in the United States. Obviously, of these two images, the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster and his sort of looking glass inverse, It was the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster who became a far more widely known and popular character, which had significant effects for the outcome of who could practice law, who did practice law in the late 19th and early 20th century, and by extension, what arguments appeared in courtrooms and the interactions, entanglements that we heard about involving Jewish law and the United States Constitution. And I think I'm going to stop there and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Britt. I'm waiting for my camera to be turned on. There we go. Wonderful. I want to, there's a lot to think about there, and we do have some questions submitted, and I just want to encourage anybody who is still thinking about what they want to ask or engage with to put their questions in the chat. So, okay, so Britt, the questions that are already in here are a mix of questions about sort of historical context and about the stereotypes themselves and sort of the meaning of them. The first one is a question about this context of the post-Civil War era. And the questioner is wondering if the view of Jewish lawyers changed at that time, or if these stereotypes arose at that time in particular related to the beginning of waves of immigration. So is it you described a context of the entrenched legal establishment pushing back against a perceived threat of incoming. So is that an immigration issue? Is that a sort of socioeconomic change issue? Is that a changing view of the American landscape in their minds? If you could just talk a little bit more about what that is. And then the second part of the question is, and I think you also touched on this after the question was submitted, but again, maybe you just want to return to it, is are there other groups, especially immigrants, and the questioner raises Catholics in particular, especially Irish immigrants, that are targeted in the same way?
Both excellent questions. Thank you so much. So to answer the first question about timing and of course the appearance of large waves of Jewish immigrants, this is a question that I also had. So the answer is the ubiquitous Jewish Shyster and the appearance of this figure predates the appearance of the waves of immigration. And that's significant for a number of reasons. Not by much, because of course immigration really tips off in 1881, but the appearance of this figure starts by the late 1860s, early 1870s. And the figure appears not in response to actual living on the ground Jewish lawyers who we know appear later, who we know really appear starting around 1900 after the first 2 decades of major immigration, but it appears in response to internal changes to the American legal profession that are taking place in the aftermath of the Civil War. We see the rise and expansion of the US federal government. We also see the emergence of the modern law school and the creation of a quasi-standard curriculum by Christopher Columbus Langdale at Harvard, which then spreads to law schools across the country. And we see the emergence of corporate law. We see the old ideal of the Lincoln lawyer who learns through an apprenticeship is no more. And so all of these shifts, who gets to permit, how one is permitted to practice law changes with the formation of bar associations and bar standards. And all of these new systems are put in place and cause a lot of disruption, in part because there are so many new practitioners. So the old established elite, and we see this is a pattern that we can see almost in any profession, right? Don't want newcomers, right? That challenges their hold on the profession, that challenges their hold on business norms. So they create this crisis, and they call the crisis overcrowding. The bar is now overcrowded, and who's doing this overcrowding? And they look to there are some Jewish lawyers that predate the waves of migration. There are Jewish lawyers who are practicing law in the United States, since the 1700s. They're far and few in between, but there are some. But it's really easy to identify them as outliers, and then when immigration picks up in the 1880s, this anti-immigration rhetoric, this anti-immigration and anti-Jewish immigration sentiment becomes merged with the reactions of the established bar. So again, this predates, although it closely parallels, but it does predate that moment of immigration. And the second question, I'm sorry, I just got so into answering that question that I forgot the second question.
The second question was about, I also got into it and I was going to ask you a follow-up, but we'll hold off. The second question was about whether other groups, especially Irish Catholics or other immigrant groups, were also targeted.
An excellent question. I myself have that question because it only seems reasonable, right? There's a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic sentiment and rhetoric that was flying around in the 19th century. I should easily be able to find a number of Catholic. So this is how I answer that question. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is to say, I have looked many times for years to find similar rhetoric about Catholic lawyers, and I haven't found, I just haven't found similar expressions of concern about Catholic lawyers, which is not to say that it doesn't exist. You know, maybe someone I've looked, if you know of any, I would be very grateful to be pointed in that direction to find it, just for comparative purposes and because I'm curious. But it's a really great question.
Amazing. So open call to the audience if you have suggestions about that. So I have a follow-up, but also another question was just dropped in, which I think is another fascinating follow-up, which is pointing out that a similar kind of professionalization happened at the same time or in the same era in the fields of medicine and business. So for example, at the Harvard Medical and Business Schools, maybe a little later, like about 1900. And they're wondering if similar kinds of Jewish caricatures happened in those fields as well. And I would just build on this question to ask whether, if not, is there a particular quality to the legal profession that's connected with Jews? Like, is rather than only a structural explanation, is there also a thematic or a sort of content-based connection?
And besides medicine, what was the other field that you mentioned? Business. Okay. So you're absolutely correct that there was definitely anti-Jewish discrimination, bigotry, even violence in some cases.
Oh, sorry, just to clarify, they're saying not that the same kind of, they're asking whether the same kind of stereotypes about Jewish doctors and businessmen took place at the same time, because a similar internal sort of structural professionalization and entrenchment of the field happened around the same time.
So not that I know of, although there was plenty of anti-Jewish sentiment within those fields. Not that I know of. Again, perhaps someone doing that research would love to share that with me. And but I do think there's the reason that the law is unique in this case, insofar as the law was perceived of, and I think rightly so, as being so central to the nation. Being so central to the nation state, right? I mean, America's Constitution is its heart, and the idea that people perceived as foreigners, true foreigners, spiritual foreigners, not just national foreigners, but spiritual foreigners, people who don't accept Christ, would have any participation, would be able to tinker, even on the edges, with something so central to the existence of the country, to the thing that makes the country exceptional. Was deeply upsetting to people, which to the extent that they would generate this abstract idea of how problematic it was for Jews to practice law.
I think so, sort of maybe along the same lines, but a little bit flipping the question. So you've been talking about the formation of these stereotypes sort of internally to the field, right, or to the profession for the most part. Obviously, the stereotypes go beyond practitioners and sort of gatekeepers in the field. And you gave many examples of lay people, journalists, right, talking about this. Is there also, on the part of non-legal professionals, an emerging distrust maybe of the role of lawyers in general, into which Jews are sort of being slotted as the scapegoat or the bad guy, right? Is there some perceived change in American society or the legal system and how it works that these stereotypes are responding to, quite apart from social changes within the field?
The answer is yes, absolutely. And the only thing is it's not apart from the social changes in the field. In fact, the lawyers in the thought, we're getting such a bad reputation. We're getting this bad rap and it's unfair. We actually are, helping to create prosperity in this country. We are helping to promote, law and order and safety and all these important bureaucracies. But there are some bad actors. We should identify them. And we are going to identify them. So the legal profession really hoped that this public sentiment, which they were so worried about, this public sentiment that did start to view lawyers with suspicion, that they could direct that anger at Jewish lawyers. That if we can identify the bad actors, then the rest of us can go back to our work.
And of course, it's a convenient group to direct it at, especially because of the stereotype of legalism or being overly legalistic, right? All right, so switching gears a little bit, one of the things, a major thing that you talked about here is the disconnect, the disproportionality of the perception or the portrayal of how many Jewish lawyers there were versus the reality. And someone has asked whether we do have any reliable data. Do we know how many Jewish lawyers or what percentage of lawyers were Jewish in the 19th and early 20th centuries, or even up to today? Like, have we actually reached a point where there is a preponderance of Jews in the legal profession?
So this is a really, really great question, something I've also spent a long time looking into. And the answer is no. But it's a no, and it's actually the evolution of the use of statistics in discussions of Jewish lawyers, which I've written about in a much longer version at length, is fascinating, because what starts off as stray assertions in newspapers about, there's one Jewish lawyer here in Dayton, becomes pretty over a few decades, discussions about Jewish statistics. And ultimately, by the 1930s, seemingly pretty sophisticated analyses of the number of Jewish lawyers in given places are being generated. And those studies have been incorporated in contemporary scholarship, as in scholarship written, let's say in the last 30 years, as supposedly accurate assessments of how many Jewish lawyers existed in a given place. However, I went back and said, well, who did these studies in the 30s? And often they're anti-Semites who are adamant about barring Jews from legal practice. And these are people actually associated with some well-known political figures. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of, I can't tell you if they're accurate, but I can tell you that there's very good reason to be highly suspicious of their accuracy. I personally would suspect they're not accurate. And the reason is this is the reason. Any place that I've seen a discussion of Jewish disproportionality has either been in discussions of Jewish success, right? So there's an ideological component as to Jewish disproportionality, which I tried to allude to in this discussion of the inverse of this ubiquitous Jewish Shyster. So Jews trying to prove Jews' merit and why Jews belong in America will point to Jewish lawyers and the disproportionality to prove their worth. And at the same time, non-Jews who have anti-Semitic views will point to Jewish disproportionality to convey why they don't belong. And so the ideological and underlying motivation for producing these numbers is too suspicious to me to find them credible. But what's also interesting is how so many scholars today have actually gone back and continue to promote this idea of disproportionality, again, continuing for ideological reasons, for whatever they're working on. When I actually think that the assessments themselves are pretty shoddy.
Okay, so we have no good data. Love it. Okay, I want to, since we're closing in on the end, I need to pause for a second to give the second password. I feel like I'm like on a children's show with the word of the day. So the second password is for the CLE credit is lawyers. That'll be the second one that you need to put in there, lawyers. Okay, and then I want to just, we do have like a number of more questions, and I'm really sorry that we're not going to get to all of them. There are a few people actually who have asked about Jewish law firms or law firms hiring Jews. So, was there just, first of all, when did Jewish law firms begin to emerge as their own independent entities? Were Jews typically excluded from being hired from non-Jewish law firms? If you can talk a little bit about that history. And also, I think one of the questions is pointing out that there's a particular stereotype about Jewish law firms and not just Jewish lawyers. And so if you want to talk about that at all.
Sure. So as I think many of you intuited, yes, Jewish lawyers were by and large excluded from Jewish law firms, or excuse me, from law firms in general, as non-Jewish law firms. But of course, law firms themselves have their own interesting history. And these like global firms that we think of today, and even large firms that we think of today, really only come into existence in there are a few here and there in the early 20th century, but really they come into existence after the mid 20th century. In both cases, Jews were not welcome to firms, non-Jewish firms. There are some stray exceptions where certain firms would hire one or two Jews, and they'd be kind of the token Jew in their given environments. But as a result, Jews instead formed they were either solo practitioners, and they were disproportionately represented as solo practitioners, people who worked on their own. Often they would form partnerships, and frequently those partnerships would be with either their brother or their father. And in fact, Jewish women frequently got into the legal profession, again, in seemingly high rates, working with either their husband, their brother, or their father as their partners, and secured and had careers as a result. So Jews formed smaller firms on their own. There's some pretty good work that exists on this. I think one of the articles is written by someone whose last name is Wald, if you want to look up more information about Jews and the eventual integration of Jews into non-Jewish law firms, which happens around the 1970s, much like Jewish integration in many other arenas in America happens after the 1970s.
Amazing. And we just have another minute or so, but just as a quick follow-up, there's a related question about Jewish admission to law schools. Were Jews typically in the 19th century, early 20th century trained in the major universities alongside non-Jews? Did they have separate training? What did even any legal education look like in this era?
So this is another really great question. In the last 30 years of the 20th century, American law schools undergo this massive transformation, and there's really the institutionalization of legal education in the university. So it's taken away from the apprentice model into the education system that we have right now. When that happens, Jews, and primarily Jews of Central European and Sephardic descent, who are here before this Eastern European Jewish wave comes in the 1880s, this Central European and Sephardic Jewish lawyers do, in some cases, enter law school. And there is a backlash already. There's a great quotation by I think a trustee at Columbia University, talking about these in 1874 about how we need to get these, Jewish boys out of here. And so there is an immediate backlash, and in fact, the imposition of admission standards and admissions tests results in large part because of the arrival or the appearance of Jews in law schools. One way that Jews who are interested in practicing law got around that was the appearance of schools, and particularly night schools in cities such as Chicago and New York, in which Jews would enroll. And particularly for Eastern European Jews, this was really important because many of them came here without much money. So many of a particular cohort in the late 1890s and really the first 2 decades of the 20th century they'd worked in factories during the day and then go to school at night. So they had a particularly rough law school experience. But yes, so the answer is there are schools that did exclude Jews. And in fact, those schools, in the act of excluding Jews, became what we think of as elite institutions today. The Harvard law schools, et cetera. Part of becoming elite was cutting off access to a particular group. I hope that answered that question.
Wonderfully, yes. And we're right on time to end for today. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Britt Tevis, for speaking to us. It's amazing how it's not only illuminating about this idea or the stereotype that I think we all kind of hold, that of the Jewish lawyer being so ubiquitous. It makes you think about where it comes from and whether you want to perpetuate it. And it's also illuminating just about the history of the legal profession. It's really wonderful. So thank you so much. To everyone who attended, I also thank you for being here, and I hope that you will come back next week, a week from today on Valentine's Day. We will have Winifred Sullivan talking about the idea of the church in the eyes of the American state and how Jews might fit into that scenario. So thank you again, Britt. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you in a week.